Sounds good.
All right. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, all right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Katie Hess, and I'm chair of RCWR. We are the Registrars Committee Western Region, and we are a nonprofit group operating under the Collections Stewardship Professional Network of AAM, and we represent registrars and collections professionals from 9 states in the Western US. Today's webinar is part of a series called Hands-On Practical Conservation for the Collections Professional that we are hosting through all of 2021. Each month, we will release a new free webinar on varying topics related to practical conservation techniques with a new conservator each month. All of our webinar recordings for this year so far are available on our YouTube page, and today's webinar will be recorded as well. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope that you will join us next month and for the rest of 2021. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to my Vice Chair, Beth Sanders, who will introduce today's speaker.
Good morning. Thank you all for being here. As Katie mentioned, my name is Beth Sanders. I'm the Vice Chair of the Registrars Committee Western Region. Our sponsor for today's webinar is Crozier Fine Arts. Crozier is the world's leading provider of fine arts storage, services, and logistics. With 1.3 million square feet of dedicated storage space across 19 locations, including Los Angeles here in the Western region, in 10 global markets, and a fleet of more than 80 specialized vehicles, Crozier serves the art world ecosystem through a strategic network that spans North America and Europe. Crozier offers unparalleled technical expertise in the handling, installation, transportation, and storing of art. Their mission is to preserve culture and innovate best practices. They protect the value and integrity of treasured assets to ensure art that matters today is here for generations to come. So thank you to Crozier for being a Tier 1 sponsor of RCWR. If you're not a member of RCWR, please consider joining today. We represent collections professionals, as Katie mentioned, in our 9 Western states. And in addition to this webinar series and at some point in the future, events in person, we also send out our weekly job listing emails, and we have our quarterly newsletter. After today's webinar, later this afternoon, all people who are in attendance will actually get a copy of one of our former newsletters because today's speaker actually contributed on this subject. So we're going to send that out to everyone to make sure that you've had an opportunity to read that article. So please do check that out. We also have stipends for conferences that RCWR is able to give, whether those conferences are virtual or in person. And membership is only $15 a year. So all of that, quite affordable. If you're not a member, please go to rcwr.org and sign up today. Today, we are extremely fortunate to have Rosa Lowinger here with us. Rosa is President and Chief Conservator at RLA Conservation of Art and Architecture, a firm with offices in Miami and Los Angeles. She's a fellow of the American Institute for Conservation and the Association for Preservation Technology. She has been a member of IIC since the 1980s, and she was the 2008-9 Rome Prize Fellow in Conservation at the American Academy in Rome. In addition to practicing conservation, she regularly writes about conservation for the mainstream media, and she's the author of a nonfiction book, Tropicana Nights, The Life and Times of the Legendary Cuban Nightclub. Before I turn it over to Rosa, just a few quick Zoom logistics. This is the webinar format, so you can see us, but we can't see you. You might be recovering from St. Patrick's Day last night in your pajamas or back in your museum, but whatever it is, be comfortable, relax, and enjoy this webinar. Great to see people chatting in the chat box. As I mentioned, you can send a message just to the panelists or to the panelists and all attendees. So make sure to use that drop down correctly. But then also take a look for the Q&A feature. So if you have questions throughout today's presentation, please put them in that area so that we can address all of those questions at the end of the presentation. Today's presentation is being recorded, so remember you'll have access to it to reference back. You don't need to furiously scribble down notes. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rosa. Stop sharing my screen.
And I can share mine.
Yes, please.
Here we go. Excellent. That worked, right? Can you hear me? Great. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm going to talk today a bit about the practical conservation issues and considerations about what to do with collections after a fire. Let me see. How do I advance my slides? Like that. Okay, excuse me. I see a lot of familiar faces and names in the crowd, and forgive me for telling you all what I do, since those of you who know me, we're a full service conservation firm that deals specifically with sculpture, objects, and three-dimensional works of art. We work for a wide range of entities, museums, public art agencies, collections, insurance companies, and art handling firms. And we have a long experience doing disaster management, primarily because of the areas where our studios are located, Miami and Los Angeles, which are both areas that are prone to lots of activity. Fires, however, are activities that can happen anywhere at any time. And this list here has some of the fires that our firm has dealt with the ones browned out at the top, ones that I dealt with before I was running our LA conservation. Prior to that, I was the founder of Los Angeles's Sculpture Conservation Studio, and I was chief conservator there until 2008. RLA was founded in 2008, and we've been doing, and we have these two offices in Miami and LA. Fires are a particularly unique type of event that I'm going to talk about in some detail before I get to the whole question of what to do once you have a fire. But let me back up a little bit to talk first about emergencies in general terms. I'm sure this group has a lot of experience thinking and imagining and preparing for emergency situations, but I just wanted to back into this a little bit. An emergency is an unanticipated event or a series of events that you're not expecting and that requires immediate action. Disaster is an event that, is when that emergency spirals out of control. And that can happen simply because there's no preparation done, but also sometimes it just happens because the type of emergency that you have is just too huge to imagine. The fire at Notre Dame is one of those things. A massive catastrophic earthquake would be that sort of thing. A combination of events, which sometimes happens. And the thing that I like to kind of have people imagine is that when you have these kinds of emergencies, there's two different basic types. One is the ones that are regional, widespread, of catastrophic proportion, where you're going to be competing with everybody else for services. And the other is the contained local events that happen in a specific institution or a specific collection, and where you might have more ability to obtain resources from outside. But in both cases, you need to be prepared in-house for what you're going to deal with. The big four are earthquakes, fires, floods, and hurricanes. These are the kinds of emergencies that happen in a massive way and really impact entire regions. But of those that I mention here, only fires also can happen just in one location at one time. So you can have a fire that is a wildfire that affects a region, or you can have a fire that just affects an institution, a building, or really even one room of an institution, as I will show you. So to begin with, I wanted to just compare the different types of events so that you get a sense of how a fire compares to, say, an earthquake. And I'm going to limit myself to the types of things that we experience here in the West and not talk too much about hurricanes, though I suppose Hawaii does have hurricanes also, but I've already spoken in Hawaii about hurricanes. An earthquake always has a regional impact. You don't have an earthquake in a neighborhood. Not one building alone is not going to be impacted by an earthquake. Usually this happens over a wide region, or or at least one part of a city will be impacted with it more strongly than other areas. It's never localized to one place. It's always rapid onset with absolutely no warning, maybe a couple of seconds if you're using one of those apps and it happens to work. They're always dangerous. Earthquakes are always dangerous, but you can have a minor earthquake that affects collections but is not life-threatening. And you always have it impact multiple objects. You don't have, say, for example, if you have a flood, sometimes you will have, only a couple of things are impacted. You have a lot of stuff that's impacted by an earthquake. And the large type of damage that you have, for the most part, you're going to be dealing with breakage. You're going to be dealing with things that fall, with things that are ruptured, and where you're not typically going to have a lot of water to deal with as well. And your main concern will be making sure that you don't lose fragments, that you don't lose pieces. And for the most part, you're going to have a limited exposure to toxins. So for example, in an earthquake, you can have a building that collapses. This is the cathedral, the Episcopal Cathedral of Port-au-Prince, Haiti, after the 2010 earthquake, where we were involved in recovery of these murals that were damaged. And you can see the size of the rubble fragments of some of the murals. But you're really, unless you have a building, modern buildings are a little bit different because, certainly the buildings that were built during the asbestos period will have asbestos, but there are always some types of toxins, but they're not, that's not your primary concern during earthquake. It's collapse of things. It's the safety of large scale elements not falling and breaking. You're always going to need volunteers during an earthquake because it typically is going to affect a wide range of institutions, and the number of conservators and collections personnel is going to be limited. I also bring up here as a sidebar windstorms and tornadoes, and I know there are people here from the Huntington, so I see that you will recognize some of the pieces that were damaged in that large windstorm of 2016. These are freak situations. We don't have too many tornadoes in the West, but we do have massive windstorms, and windstorms can topple things that you would not believe. Again, the issue is breakage. There might be a need for rapid stabilization, and you're going to have a lot of additional other debris. You're going to have lots of tree limbs all over the place. But not in that way of in an earthquake where you have whole buildings are collapsing from, you're not going to have buildings collapsing from wind typically. It's usually limited to artworks that are located outdoors. And you're really not going to have much of a toxin issue because these are things that are happening in the outdoor space. You'll have some warning sometimes because there can be forecasts for winds, but that doesn't mean there's much you can do about it. Except protect your personnel. So now let's cut to fires. Fires, unfortunately, they're now a real ongoing reality in the West. They're always a reality everywhere because a fire can happen in any building at any time. And the fire that I'm going to speak to the most is the fire at the San Gabriel Mission, which took place in July of 2020 in the middle of the pandemic last year. The cause of the fire is not really known. There seems to be some thought that it was related to construction, and that's something that is really always a factor. Many fires happen during renovation projects, during construction. All you need is one can of solvent left open next to some rags, and this kind of devastation can occur. But there are other reasons for fires that are localized. There can be arson, there can be electrical fires within the walls of buildings, and of course, the wildfire, which is the one regional type of activity event that happens related to this kind of disaster. Now, the thing about fires, they're unique in a certain way. All fires are rapid onset. They, with a wildfire, you might know it's coming. It might start somewhere and they track the path of it. They're always life-threatening. That is to say, you can have a minor earthquake and be in a building and nothing's going to happen to you, but you cannot be in a building with a fire. Anything that's in the path of a fire has the potential to be devastated. The damage is chemical and physical. Things will break, they'll collapse, as you see here in this photo of the sanctuary of the San Gabriel mission. With at the far end, you see the reredos, which is the retablo at the end of the mission that I'm going to speak about in some detail. One of the most significant issues with a fire, though, is that all the byproducts are toxic. I'm sure all of us in this space here remember what the sky looked like in September last year when it was orange, when we found it hard to breathe, when it was, especially in California, Oregon, Washington, where we suddenly looked at a world where our intake of breath was in itself problematic. So imagine that after, when the fire is in your institution or when you're dealing with the aftermath, those products are always there. And the other thing is, almost all fires are preventable. Obviously, even wildfires are preventable, but certainly within buildings, they're typically preventable situations. And that's why management of collections and how the buildings are cared for are so important in regard to this. So now we get to the actual nuts and bolts of the fire itself. Why are they so damaging? What causes them? A fire is the result of combustion. What is combustion? It's a very, very fast chemical reaction that takes place between something physical, oxygen, and the right conditions, and something that ignites. These processes, as you know, generate an extreme amount of heat that will damage property, that will damage human life. And the worst part about it is that the more the fire goes, the more it self-generates, self-perpetuates, and creates additional damage. The extreme heat of the fire, the flames, are lethal, of course, to human beings, damaging to every single kind of material. You see here Notre Dame and the devastating fire that took place there. And one of the things that we now know about that fire is that that smoke that is pluming upward was full of lead from the building itself and extremely toxic to the residents that live nearby. And then again, once a fire begins, it runs a course that you can't always predict. And the only way to stop it is to remove the combustion, that is, remove the combustibility of the materials that are in the path of the fire. That's why you sometimes see for wildfires that they do a controlled burn around a fire area, because if they can stop what is burning, they can stop the fire. But the main thing that makes a fire so awful is that the combustion of plastics, metals, asbestos, and other toxic byproducts give you this kind of morass of materials that impact your collections and impact your personnel as well. So what are the different types of fire damage? Fire damage, apart from the physical collapse of things, so for example, if a roof like the roof of Notre Dame burns and things start to fall, you have that physical damage of things falling onto other things. The fire itself, the product of the combustion, breaks down into three main types of damage. You have objects that are charred, and that is essentially objects that are fully burned. They become charcoal. They are often beyond recovery, but not always beyond recovery. And sometimes you want to recover them anyway, even if they are charred. Many archaeological materials that give us information about, say, organic materials that existed in the past, we know because they burned, and we have the charred remains because those turn into something else that is more easy to sustain over time. But that's a charred object. Then the second type of damage are scorched objects. Scorching is a local surface charring, meaning that what's on the surface of the artwork or the building or whatever burns, but what's underneath it remains intact or partially intact. And that's where, so for example, these are some of the sculptures on the reredos at the San Gabriel mission. And you see they are completely black, but they're not charred. They didn't fully burn. And you can see remnants of the paint and gilding underneath the surface. So in this case, what happened was that these particular sculptures that were on the upper level of the reredos, so closer to the burning of the roof and closer to where the fire gets hottest, because that's the other thing. Since heat rises, you're going to always have more fire damage high up in a building. These sculptures have scorched and charred, burnt materials on their surface. And some of this is the surface of the works themselves, and some of it is other sooty, oily materials that have deposited onto the surface. But scorching is a hard product. It's not something that you can wipe away like soot, which is what I'm going to get into next. And then the third thing that you have is soot, which is deposited smoke. Also it's the result of incomplete combustion. When you have a fire, everything that is in the vicinity is going to be covered in soot. And when I'm talking, when you have a wildfire in Los Angeles, you have to assume that it is possible that your collection is completely impacted by it. So even if you don't see soot on the surface of your collection, it bears looking into whether it actually has soot on it. And similarly, if you have a fire in a building, unless you have a building where your air filtration systems are designed to be very limited to places, so that, for example, you can say our storage is completely separate from the building itself, you really always need to check your collections to make sure that soot isn't deposited on them for some other reason. So for example, I'm going to show a bit of this at the San Gabriel mission, how certain collections that were not in the burned area, because the burning occurred within the sanctuary of the church itself, but they have a museum, but just that amount of combustion in the vicinity, unless you have a very sealed building, you're going to have soot deposit on your works to a greater or lesser extent. The good news is that you can clean this off, but you got to know it's there. So the other thing about soot is what it is, it's the product of incomplete combustion, and the particle size is very tiny. And the problem is that the particle size of soot is associated with lung penetration. People with respiratory problems, asthma, bronchitis, chronic coughs are going to have problems when there's a lot of soot in the air, and they're going to have problems working on the collection. And also, soot is known to be carcinogenic in certain quantities, and well, actually, carcinogenic basically is something that it can cause cancer without any indication of the amount. So you really need to protect yourself. And this is one of the things that we make a big point of telling people, is that when you're dealing with fire damage, only trained personnel should handle these materials. It's really not that possible to use volunteers. In earthquakes, you can use volunteers. You can train people to do volunteer work to do earthquake recovery. Fire recovery is a slightly different animal. And you really need to know something of the medical history of the people that are working in fire recovery because of all the toxicity issues. And you have to have really good PPE for fire recovery. So you need the following, and especially if you have a building where there's, if you have a building that's been damaged, you need to have the proper type of construction gear: hard hats, hard-soled closed-toed shoes, long pants, and long sleeves. You don't want this material getting all over yourself. And the staff has to be prepared for working on this. And when you're doing this kind of recovery, now we're so used to wearing masks all the time that it might not be that big a deal, but it used to be in the past that, wearing a mask for a long period of time required a lot of breaks. But given the toxic levels of materials that you're dealing with, you really have to have that kind of time frame for work. So let's start now with the first steps after a fire. As with all emergencies, we're going to be limited to when we can go in, to when the first responders tell us that we can go in. We have to wait it out until they tell us it's safe to enter a building. So then the first thing we got to do is figure out what's going on with the objects. Are they charred? Are they scorched? or do they just have soot damage? Obviously, things that are charred are going to be the most difficult to deal with, following things that are scorched, and then soot damage. You have to design your plan for moving things, for dealing with them, so you're not going to damage things further. Things that are burned or things that are soot covered can really get further damaged by the way they're handled. Some of them are beyond repair, but not always. And you want to, I like to give scorched objects the first priority. And you're always going to need a conservator to opine on this. You really should have a conservator there for the moving of things. So while we're waiting for the site access, because usually after such an event, and this is true with many emergency events, you're going to have some time to wait until you can get into your building or into your facility. This is the time to be planning. Contact conservators, contact art handlers, review your emergency response plan, and gather all your supplies, materials, and equipment. We at our studios always keep fire supplies on hand, because fire doesn't give you a warning. It happens. We keep earthquake supplies, fire supplies. In May of each year, June of each year, we gather our hurricane supplies in South Florida, and we review all of our inventories, have generators ready for working, and review what your salvage protocols are by material type. One thing I didn't put on here is it should be really clear who's running your show, because often what will happen is the first responders will initially run the show, as they should, but they should not be dealing with the artworks. And similarly, you'll have an institution. Obviously, when something of this nature happens, the institution itself designates, okay, so-and-so is going to be in charge, but that doesn't mean that's the person who should be working on how to recover the materials. And by the way, in this slide here, which is the reredos, you can see how the sculptures on the lower range, on the lower tier of the reredos have soot damage, but you can still see all their colors. And the ones further above on the upper register are completely covered with scorching, or the products of scorch. So there's a lot of information here. I'm kind of going to skip through it a little bit because I think you can look at it later. But these are the things, once you have access to the site, you're going to want to do, you're going to be Sherlock Holmes. You're going to do a lot of documentation. You really want to have two people so that somebody can be doing photographs and somebody could be recording what you're seeing. That information of what you're seeing, it's like you're going into a crime scene. You want to see what you see and describe in detail. You want to make sure that nobody is moving anything until the collections personnel have a chance to examine and make sure that something of value or importance is not mixed in there, because junk and collection objects will look the same, since everything's going to be blackened by either soot or char on the top. The other thing, and I'm not getting into it this much here, fire damage also often includes water damage, because typically when the fire is put out, water is sprayed all over the collection or all over the building. That's how you put out the fire for the most part. And wet items with soot on them are, the sort of trifecta of difficult to deal with. They can still be salvaged though. But how you deal with it is very important. And, you might have all kinds of toxic materials mixed in with that water. Dead animals can be in that water. You really don't know. But most significantly is how you lift these things is going to be the first issue. So, for example, with soot damaged objects, we like to try to do as much cleaning in situ as possible. But when you have this amount of water, you first have to get rid of the water, and then you have to sort of move objects out to dry before you can even begin to deal with the soot removal, because the water is going to supersede it. Then you want to prioritize by material type. The objects with charred areas or structural damage are going to be the most unstable. They should be given the first priority in terms of their moving out of those spaces. You've got to remove these with conservator supervision. The best art handlers know how to do it, but you should still have a conservator and you should still be recording everything that's going on. Because, for example, in this pile that you see here at the San Gabriel Mission, there are all kinds of medallions and collection objects, but who would know unless you really have a great deal of photography and sorting. And when you start to move these things out of the way, then later a cleanup crew will come in. You want to be able to make sure nothing gets thrown away by accident. When you have a large display, such as like the Raritos that I was telling you about, you're not going to remove that if you don't have to. But if you're going to have a lot of workers coming in to, say, repair a roof, you want to be able to cordon those off and barricade them from undue damage by people moving around, by them spraying water, by dropping things from a ceiling. And you want to know where things are going. And in moving sculptures, for example, you want to know where they're going to go before you move them. The image on the right is the mission's rapid response to removing the Raritos sculptures, which turned out okay, even though this would not have been the way I would have recommended. They were taken down by a construction company before a conservator had any chance to weigh in on what might be the first thing to do. The objects weren't wrapped. They were strapped directly on the surfaces. Again, I say nothing happened, but it was because in this case, the particular construction company that did it is extremely skilled and has a lot of experience, but I don't recommend doing that. The other thing too, firefighters should not be moving the paintings. They should, you're going to basically just have people moving them around without any kind of real clarity about where they're going, without photography before they're moved. And there really is always an opportunity to photograph before you can move things, and that should always be done. So these paintings were taken away from an area, and we don't know what's around them. Were there bits of frame lying around there? You should have a conservator or a collections specialist there to really be managing all of that movement. So let me go now a little bit into how you conserve the works once you've got them out of the space. So most of the work you're going to do to conserve collections, for the most part, you're going to be dealing with soot removal, because for every object that's charred, there's 10 that aren't charred and they have soot on the surface. Of course, charred and scorched pieces are going to require more time to remove, but soot removal is really what I like to tell people is, the thing about fires is when they don't actually hit you directly and they're only, you're only in the path of it, soot removal is extremely rewarding because it is almost possible you can almost always do it safely. The thing is, soot is oily and will become acidic, so you have to do it. In the case of this particular artwork that was in a fire, in a local collection fire in South Texas, the works were covered in soot. They were in the building with the soot. This is a marble sculpture, so typically speaking, the marble itself doesn't combust. It could have had scorched materials deposited onto it if something, say, fell on it, or if you had a lot of plastics burning in the area. But in this case, even though it was absolutely looked like it could never be repaired, it was completely cleanable. So the way to make this happen is to begin by dry cleaning in situ to the extent possible. If you can sort of clean the area of everything that is debris or dirt and get the room as clean as possible, and then clean your works in situ before someone takes a glove to it and holds them and smears that soot into the pore structure of something, you have a way better chance of cleaning them. And you begin always by vacuuming. So vacuuming is the first step. You want to use portable canister vacuums with long hoses, crevice tools, micro attachments, some of which you have to make yourself. You want a HEPA filter. And your attachments are going to frequently require cleaning, because that's the other thing. When you're vacuuming soot, you're going to deposit a lot of soot into the vacuum. You want to clean your attachments as much, at least once a day, so you can make sure that you're not just creating a situation of redepositing the soot. And the key thing is your initial soot is not going to disrupt the surface at all. You want to sort of hover your vacuum over the surface to remove as much as possible before you actually make contact with the surface. I know that in my previous slide, Christina Varvey, who's in that image, was not wearing proper PPE, but that's because a lot of the bad soot had already gone away. And frankly, that photo was taken maybe almost 10 years ago, and we've come a long way in thinking about, the levels of safety that we have to undertake for this kind of work. So pieces within the direct fire zone are always going to have water damage. Not always. They're typically going to have water damage as well as soot damage. And here you see that objects that were not even in the same room were going to be impacted by soot. The two pieces, these are both San Gabriel Mission Fire pieces. On the left, you see me vacuuming a pieta. This is a pieta. I don't know if you can quite see, but in the blue cloak, there is a great deal of flaking paint that might have been there before, might have been a product of water damage, but either way, the initial soot that can be removed is very limited by that particular flaking. So I'm working in areas that are accessible without any flaking around them. And this is another thing for your insurance carriers, that even if this, for example, an object like this, even if it has pre-existing flaking paint that had nothing to do with the fire damage, the fact of the matter is, in order to remove the soot, you have to consolidate the flaking paint, and it just then becomes part of the treatment itself. On the right, you see Conservator Anna Funke from our Los Angeles office doing cleaning of the objects in the Museum of the San Gabriel Mission. And these are pieces that were, for the most part, left in situ. The particular objects that she's working on are part of a nativity scene that was in the sanctuary itself and moved into the museum. But everything else around that you see is exactly the way it was displayed before the fire. And there was a thought to begin with from the insurance carrier that because these pieces were not in the direct path of the fire or in the room with the fire, they were a couple of rooms away, that they didn't have any soot on them. But when they sent an industrial hygienist to check the works, they were indeed all covered in soot. And what we did for this work is we vacuumed off all of the soot, and we did we did an initial vacuuming. No, we didn't vacuum all the soot. We did an initial vacuuming in situ before the works were packed to be moved. And then the works were packed and moved to an art handling facility where we were given a room to work in that was designated as our own workroom. And so objects were brought in and taken away, and we were able to do the additional cleaning steps there and some of the other related work like consolidation. By the way, this project is ongoing. We just finished the phase 1 work, which was the museum object cleaning. So the proper methods for soot removal, to recap: try to remove as much as possible in situ, use a vacuum with a HEPA filter, hover the nozzle first on your first pass. Don't try to move the works before the worst soot is removed. Of course, the caveat is if they're wet or if you have to because the building is unsafe, then you have to work with your conservator to do that. And if you're going to use volunteers, you can only have them treat the least sensitive material, and they have to be trained. You can't just sort of have them train on the job. The next step after vacuuming, this is the fun part of soot removal, is the sponging. Because again, you want to do as much dry cleaning as possible because the soot is oily. And before you put anything that's damp on the surface, you want to get as much dry as possible. By the way, that's true with any cleaning process. When we do regular sculpture maintenance, we dry clean everything before we damp clean it or before we solvent clean. So there are all kinds of wonderful tools. Everybody has their favorites. I am particularly fond of polyurethane makeup sponges, those white wedges and circles that you see there, because they're very soft. They don't drag on the surface. You can really have a very light touch and pick up quite a bit of soot. And then of course there are the soot sponges that are really good for heavy duty soot as well, because they kind of absorb them into the surface. Additional cleaning steps are using broomstick and kneaded erasers or white vinyl erasers, and then various solvent mixtures, cotton with denatured alcohol and water. Of course, sometimes you want to use a conservation grade detergent with distilled water. But again, only the first step, vacuuming, should ever be undertaken by anyone but a conservator. And really, this is something you want to do under supervision, because it can go, it's like totally repairable stuff unless it's done incorrectly. So here you have the cleaning of some objects from the San Gabriel mission and other fires. You can see that sponge that you see on the left. I'm showing this as a difference. This is an object that was cleaned after a fire, and this is after the soot was removed. When the sponge comes up, that color that you see on the left, that's no longer soot. Soot is the color of what you see on the right. It's really black, but until you, or not always really, it always is typically black. But what happens is when you start to clean the soot of a collection that's been exposed to a fire, each kind of fire will have its own color of soot. And what happens is, as you're cleaning, then you know when you've gotten to the place where you've removed as much as possible. I hope that makes sense. So under the original, under the surface charring and scorching, you often find the original surface. If you remember those very blackened figures that I showed you at the beginning from the San Gabriel mission Raritos, on the right, you see one of them in the process of being cleaned. And what you can see is that a lot of the original paint is underneath there, a lot of the original gilding. Behind the figure on the of San Gabriel, on the front of this photo, you see the two figures from the lower part of the Raritos that don't really have any of that scorch damage at all on the surface. And on the left, you see a technician from our firm using a solution of denatured alcohol and water to remove some of the that sooty sort of char surface from the finish. And by the way, painted finishes are of course among the most difficult to conserve, because you're basically using often a solvent or a solvent gel to remove those deposited products on the surface. And you have to make you have to distinguish between the original finish. Also, very often the soot removal will remove restorations and overpaint. And when you have, say, these types of 19th century painted wood sculptures that were often repaired many times, it becomes very tricky to know what you have. The assessment of these works also has to take into account, as I said, surface loss, mold, discoloration of finishes. And here you see those nativity sculptures that were first vacuumed with at the San Gabriel mission. This is our cleaning facility at Cook's Crating in Los Angeles. They were the selected company that the mission chose to be the art handling partner. And that's one of our conservators finishing the work on this nativity. And again, even though it was very likely that the flaking paint on these painted plaster pieces was partially there, at least before the fire, there was no way to consolidate the surfaces without, there's no way to remove the soot without the consolidation. And in fact, the water damage did impact some of the paint, and we had a lot of paint loss. So when you're discussing this with your insurance carrier and they want to say, well, that flaking paint is not part of the damage, it actually really is. A couple of additional recommendations for working with indoor pieces. You should always be thinking about where things are going to go. You're going to need a dirty room to work on things. You're going to need well, ideally you have three spaces. You have the space where things are stored, you have the space where they're worked on, and then you have a clean room where everything is kept afterward. And sometimes too, if you have a lot of organic materials, you're going to need to have air scrubbers so that the soot scent, the smoke scent is removed from the objects. And that is only done by just, having air scrubbers that, use ozone and other air exchanges to reduce the scent. A couple of notes on outdoor pieces. We work on a lot of pieces that are impacted by wildfires, and some of the instinct is just to wash these as quickly as possible. And the recommendation is not to do that. You really want to dry remove soot before you wash, even if pieces have been rained on, you still need to do this. This is a sculpture by Ai Weiwei that we're actually working on as we speak. This was impacted by one of the fires in Northern California. The small image at the left that you see is soot removal on the surface after the sculpture had been rained on a dozen times. So typically you want to dry remove all the soot. You don't want to use only water, but there are exceptions. This piece actually proves to be one of the exceptions. And if you have bronzes or varnished pieces, you want to definitely have those finishes inspected to see if you need to replace the varnish. We just routinely replace the wax on all bronzes that are exposed to wildfires. A couple of other important considerations that you have here, and I'll just leave you to look at these later. And in conclusion, putting together your fire emergency plan. These are basics that apply to all types of disasters, but the truth is these kinds of presentations, just having your mind thinking this through is really important to knowing how you're going to respond to something like this, to be thinking about your collection right now. If right now you have a fire in your building right now, as we're speaking here, there's a fire in your building. Do you know how you're going to identify the most vulnerable things? How are you going to identify what's damaged? Who are you going to call? Who's going to be in charge? How are you going to make the case for collections personnel to manage the recovery of the collections themselves? There's a lot of resources. The Getty's book, Building an Emergency Plan, is really, really good. But the Alliance for Response and Americans for the Arts, there are all kinds of organizations that have resources for creating these emergency plans for fires, for earthquakes, for hurricanes, and whatnot. And by the way, this is our contact information. You can reach us either at the info or your collections personnel are always welcome to reach out to me and Christina or any of our conservators directly. We don't give that out to everybody, but you guys can always have it. And following the end of this presentation, I have another couple of other resources that you can look at, but I think I'll stop here and see if there are any questions.
Thank you, Rosa. And so just a reminder, everyone can put their questions into the Q&A feature and we'll be able to answer those. So the first question we have that came in is, I'd imagine the insurance claim can be complicated. How do you estimate the potential cost of the repair so there's money to begin before fully evaluating the repair work that would need to be done?
Okay. First of all, you can't. You have to evaluate. And any insurer that works with a collection knows this. All of the major insurance companies know this. And in fact, they're not going to want you to guesstimate on that, because the first thing you need to know is what's the scope of the damage, what's even repairable, what's not. That has to be evaluated. And all the big insurers, AIG, Chubb, AXA, Pure, McLaren's, they're all really, they're all valuable. They all know what they're doing. But this is an interesting thing, because in a fire that we dealt with recently, the claims people that were assigned were not the fine arts people, they were the building people, because the building was really damaged. And the building people, while very good, don't always understand all of the ins and outs of the fine arts claim. And for example, they were very much working, as they do with construction claims, on cost estimates, you know, the lowest estimate. So that doesn't always work, because one of the things I really have to tell you is this is not the kind of thing that every conservator knows how to do. Any conservator can easily learn it. You do one and you know how to do some of it, but I can tell you I've been doing this for so many years, and each time I am walloped with a new conundrum. For example, just recently on this fire damage claim that we're doing out in Northern California for a private collection, one of the things that I had no idea about is that exposure to fire can impact the passivation of stainless steel. Meaning, if you have stainless steel sculptures that are exposed to a fire directly, maybe they don't get burned, but their ability to resist corrosion is impacted, and they have to be treated for that. So how did we find this out? Only because in working with one particular sculpture, we brought a metallurgist and a metallurgical engineer to evaluate the work, and we were told this. So what I'm trying to say is, your insurance company should be aware of the fact that this is not an issue for the lowest bidder. This is for the most experienced. Volcanic ash.
Yes. Is conservation of items impacted by volcanic ash different in techniques from those from a regular fire soot?
No, the techniques are the same. What I would do if I were to deal with a collection that was impacted by volcanic ash, I would want to have more analysis done on the content of the ash to make sure there weren't any products there that were especially corrosive in some way or another, because, you know, there may be something else in there. And also, if you're dealing with volcanoes, and I guess, you know, there may be other issues. If you're dealing with volcanoes that are coastal, you want to think about what if there's any impact of salts on a surface that are also covered in volcanic ash. And by the way, ash and soot are different. Ash is much easier to remove than soot, because ash doesn't have quite the oiliness of soot. Soot is that direct combustion byproduct.
How close would you need to be to a wildfire to potentially have soot on your collections?
It depends. It depends on how the wind blows, literally. So you can be obviously, if you're close to it, you can have a fire. Like, for example, when we had the fires in September, you know, I recommended to any client that was in the hills, even if they were not close to the fire, to just take a cosmetic sponge to the surface of something and look and see what they thought, because you really can be pretty far away and have the soot still on it.
So I'm going to follow that up with one of my own questions, because you mentioned bringing in an IH specialist or an IH technician to inspect for soot in other rooms where they thought it was okay. Is that something that would be a next step after the cosmetic sponge, or would that be a preliminary?
Wait, a next step after to do what? To bring the, no, that's preliminary. That's preliminary. Because sometimes this is basically so that sometimes you need to do that in order for your insurance company to recognize, yes, this entire collection was not in the room with the fire. It was in the building next door. It was not even in the same building, it was the building next door. And they're going to say, well, it wasn't impacted by the fire. So you want to have them come in and look at that. But you could actually do that. But sometimes you don't see anything when you do that. Or you see something and somebody might say to you, well, that's just dirt because your collection hasn't been well maintained. That's why you want to bring that person in. There's a question here about reusing cosmetic sponges. You know, we've never done that. I hear you. I hear you. I feel like it would be nice to, because you create a lot of waste. But the thing is, in order to fully clean those sponges, you need to use a solvent to make sure they were really clean. And I'm not sure it could withstand it. But you know what? Having you say that makes me think I'm going to try that, see if I can clean them. You'd have to use a conservation grade detergent because you don't want to deposit anything. Oh, Elizabeth Hanston is asking about stainless steel and soot. This blew my mind, by the way. We were just like totally, shocked about it. Essentially, what happens is that there is a product of combustion on stainless steel. There is a sculpture that we happen to be working on, and it didn't melt. Obviously, stainless steel is pretty high melting temperature. It didn't distort or melt. The fire around it didn't raise the heat to the level that could have even gotten close to that. But all of the welds on this sculpture, and it had multiple welds, it's a sculpture made out of many pieces of steel that are welded together. Every weld had a bit of corrosion on it. And we didn't really think much about that. We thought, well, they haven't been maintaining the piece. And our engineer basically said that that is one of the things that can happen. It could reduce, because what happens is what makes, the reason stainless steel, to give you a sort of superficial answer, stainless steel, what makes it passivated to corrosion is that it has its iron reduced from the surface, and it has a richer other surface that is more resistant to corrosion. But what happens is the fire combusts some of that, even if it doesn't burn the sculpture, and impacts the chemical composition of the top surface. And so what happened over time as we've been working on this collection, we've been looking at this piece and we've noticed that it's getting more and more orange. It's just starting to have a color kind of like a little bit like Beth's hair, actually. It's got a little color like just sort of hazing over it. Now, this is totally conservable, is restorable. You can passivate it back and get back to what you need to be, but it has to be done. And an insurance company wouldn't know that unless that was really illustrated to them.
We just got a question in the chat. So just a reminder, if you have more questions, pop them into the Q&A box. But Deborah is wondering what kind of air scrubbers you recommend and how do you mitigate ozone on the collection?
I don't offhand know which ones I recommend, but I can actually look that up for you. That we have that information, but I don't have it off the top of my head. There's a lot of great, by the way, there is a lot of great training through FEMA, but the bottom line is what you're doing with an individual object, FEMA's not going to be able to tell you how to do that. And the important thing, what my experience has given to me is that this group, the collections personnel, have to drive the train on what's going to be done with the collection. And that means being at the table from the outset. Because typically collection specialists and conservators are sort of relegated to tier 2, and that's okay if you have a building that is unstable. And if they're trying to, make sure that there's structural stability. But if anything that's collection is going to be moved or impacted, somebody from collections care has to be in charge.
Well, that seems like a great way to sum it up. So thank you so much, Rosa, and to everyone who joined today. Before we go, I just wanted to announce our next 2 webinars.
Wow. Great.
So on Thursday, April 15th, I apologize, I hit the wrong button. On Thursday, April 15th, we'll have Emily Durst of the Conservation Studio of Seattle talking about conservation hinging for works of art on paper. And then on May 20th, Gina Watkinson of the Arizona State Museum will speak about the care and cleaning of baskets. We're really excited to continue presenting all of these webinars. They've been a lot of fun for us to present. I'm learning a lot and hope that you are too. So if there's a topic you think we're missing in some of these webinars, please don't hesitate to reach out, or if you know a conservator who, like Rosa, is an amazing presenter and has such a wealth of knowledge, please do let us know and we can get in touch with them and see if they wanted to be involved in a future webinar. The April 15th webinar registration is open. You can go to our website at rcwr.org, and under Learn, you'll see the Workshops tab, and there's more information and the link to register. Before I go, here we have both mine and Rosa's email addresses back up here on the screen. Don't hesitate to reach out for any questions about RCWR generally or these webinar series. Or as Rosa said, if you have, her email inbox is open to collections professionals for more information about this. Thank you again so much to Rosa and to all of you for joining us. This has been really wonderful. And we'll have this up on our YouTube page within a few days, so you can check back and reference anything you might have missed. But aside from that, we look forward to seeing you in April, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.